Hey everybody, welcome to this episode of FlyBy, presented by the National Model Aviation Museum. I'm your host, Claire, and today we're stepping out of the hobby shop to meet with District 3 VP, Tournament of Champions competitor, and Super-Fli donor, Mark Radcliffe.
Hello, my name is Mark Radcliffe, and I'm presenting before you today an airplane called the Super-Fli. In 2010, I submitted it to the AMA Museum to see if they were interested in it, and it got accepted to the museum. So it was delivered here in 2010, and this aircraft has been hanging here ever since, and I'm very proud that it's part of the collection. And I think it represents it's commonplace now in the model world to see giant airplanes, quarter scale, 50% scale, 60% scale is not uncommon in aerobatic aircraft. And this was the beginning of that, the 1978 TOC. I believe IMAC or a similar version of IMAC had just been invented back then, and they were starting to have a few limited competitions. But the Tournament of Champions in Las Vegas is what really spurred the competition on around the world. So this represents that. I think it's a great airplane for the museum to have that shows the history of how these started out small and now they're giant. After the '78 event, we all learned a lot. Hanno Pretner showed us that we were going to have a bigger airplane and fly it much slower and much more scale-like to do good. So when the 1980 TOC was announced, we made that event again, the top 20 in the world, and we showed up with a Laser 200. At the time, the Laser 200 was flown by full-scale pilot Leo Laudenslager, and he was winning world aerobatic championships with it, and we figured if it's that good in full scale, it ought to work good in the model. We contacted a designer named Wayne Allery, who lives in Springfield, Ohio, and Wayne designed a Laser 200. I believe it was probably about an 80-inch wingspan, and it was built extremely light, and it seemed to fit all the requirements we needed. Definitely a bigger airplane. We still had the power plant issue, and what we ended up doing with that was that airplane was designed. We had an OS 90 in the nose with a tuned pipe on it, and it had a gear drive system, a belt gear drive system on it. So we were able to take the OS 90 and gear it down 2-to-1. So the engine was turning approximately 14,000 RPM, and the prop was only turning 7,000. And if you're familiar with what a Cox TD-051 sounds like when it's screaming running, believe it or not, turning this big propeller and this big airplane, this engine sounded a lot like that. The engine was screaming and the propeller was turning pretty slow. And it was a pretty successful setup. So we competed with that in 1980, a bigger airplane. We did pretty good. Then in '82, they had the tournament again, and we went with a bigger laser. Wayne Allery designed a 100-inch wingspan laser. And by this time, engines were starting to evolve a little bit. An engine came on the market called the Tartan Twin. It was imported by World Engines, and it was built in Italy. And it was a little twin 2.6 cubic inch size motor. This was unheard of at the time. Nobody was doing a twin like that. It was a two-cycle alcohol fuel mixture engine. It wasn't a gasoline motor. And some of the gasoline power plants that were out there at that time were converted chainsaw motors. They were heavy, they vibrated a lot, and so forth. This Tartan Twin was a very light, compact motor. For its size, it put out good power. And so that's what we flew in the '82 tournament, and did fairly well with that. I believe I placed 7th in that event with that airplane, and that was the '82 or the 100-inch wing. And that was the last TOC I flew in. I had decided that I was going to have to retire. Life was beginning to take over. I had a full-time career. I had family. I had house and all the stuff that happens in real life, and decided that it was time for me to take a break from this event. So that was my history with these airplanes, and as everybody knows that can watch what happened after that, the airplanes just kept getting bigger and bigger, and then we got into 3D aerobatics, and I attribute it to, this was the start of it in 1978, and it started a whole new revolution to think a lot bigger and to get engines that were a lot bigger and to make engines specific for model airplanes, not just taking chainsaw motors and converting them and so forth. At the 1977 TOC, we were at the event and we were flying our traditional pattern airplanes. It was announced at that event, that was the fall of '77, that in the 1978 tournament they were going to go a completely different route. They were going to require scale type aircraft. They were going to follow the Aresti type maneuver system that they use in full-scale aerobatics, and which, by the way, is what the IMAC uses today, is the Aresti version of the maneuvers. So basically this went from our traditional thinking, which in a typical pattern back in those days was we would fly into the center and perform 3 inside loops, and that would get judged. And as soon as we were done with those 3 loops, that was all that was judged, and we would go up to the end and turn around with a split S, and we would come back downwind and maybe with a 4-point roll. So that was the traditional style. Well, the Aresti in the box type maneuvers is an entirely different deal. You don't do 3 inside loops in front of you. You may perform 1 inside loop in front of you. Okay, so you finish that maneuver. However, when that maneuver is finished, you're still being judged up to the end of a box with 45-degree lines coming out from center, and you say the next maneuver will be a turnaround maneuver. We'll say it's a vertical climb with a hammerhead turn and a half roll down and back into the middle. So now we're back into the middle. We're still being judged. The turnaround was judged. Now we're coming downwind. We're back in the middle, and maybe you have to do a slow roll from inverted to inverted. So that maneuver gets judged. And then it goes up here to the other end, and maybe this time we do a half of a Cuban 8 to reverse the pattern. Again, that maneuver is judged. So it was an entirely different way of thinking for the traditional pattern flyers like all of us. You know, we were just using this one maneuver at a time, being able to go up here and turn around at your leisure, figure out, get all set up for the next maneuver. Now, every single thing you're doing is being judged. It starts the minute you start in the middle of the box. The turnarounds are all judged, everything's judged. So it was a big transition. Most of us struggled with it quite a bit, but we finally figured it out, and that's what it is today. Not only is IMAC doing it that way, but now the traditional pattern flying is doing it the same way. They're using a Aresti style maneuvering system, and they're using the box. It was quite a difference to get adjusted to it. When they announced this in '77, here was the kicker that was kind of neat. The full-scale Super-Fli flew a demonstration at noontime every day, and their pilot, Steve Nelson, who is a modeler that lives in California, Steve was a good friend of Phil Craft's, and Steve flew this Super-Fli, the full scale, quite often to air shows and stuff for Phil when Phil couldn't fly it. So Steve, actually, they had announced the maneuver list that we were going to do, and Steve flew the full scale aircraft, Super-Fli, flew the maneuvers that we were going to be flying in the TOC for '78. So it kind of gave us a preview of what we got to learn to do. And I'll never forget it. That's kind of when it went into my mind that maybe we just ought to do a Super-Fli. It looks like it performs those maneuvers pretty well, and Dad agreed with that. My dad, helped build, and we did this together. So, and the real neat thing was we had to learn to read Aresti maneuvers, and that's pretty common now. But back then, none of us knew what that was. And I will never forget. After Steve Nelson flew the full-scale demo, and he came back to our event, he landed at the local airport and came back to our event, and I started talking to him about it. And I never will forget, he sat down with me and explained just the basic elements of arrestee style maneuvers. The loop, what the loop sequences look like and the rolls, and just the basics, so that I could look at a complicated arrestee pattern and learn to figure it out. So he sat down with me and did that, and I never have forgotten that. And I've been in touch with him quite often concerning this model Super-Fli. He's honored that it's in the museum too, and he's been out here and seen it too. So that's how this all evolved.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of FlyBy. As always, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or corrections, please email us at museum@modelaircraft.org. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.